clan, but he happened to be from a grouping within that clan that was on bad times, Bani Hashim. Now, just prior to his 40th lunar year, because the Muslims, when they talk about years, they're talking about lunar years, which is about 11 days short of a solar year each year. So his 40th lunar year would probably be about 39 years of age in terms of solar, little less probably. At the age, just before his 40th birthday, he began to see some dreams in the tradition, but he would go off to a mountain just outside of Mecca, and during that time, the word that was used to describe what he was doing was tahannuth. And in Arabic, hint is polytheism. Tahannuth means to avoid polytheism, to avoid idols. So he was going out to this place and he would meditate in this cave. And we really don't have a description of the actual practices that he was doing. But there was a tradition amongst the Arabs called the Hunafa or the Hanif. And these were people who were inclined towards a type of monotheism. They did not worship the idols, they did not believe in the idols, but they did not necessarily speak out against the idols of the Jahili Arabs or the Arabs prior to the Prophet Muhammad's mission. So he would go to this cave, and in the 40th year, in the month of Ramadan, he had an experience. Now there are many ways to look at this experience, and Western Orientalists generally said wretched things about the Prophet. If you read early traditional literature coming out of Europe, just really not very nice things. They've become a lot nicer recently. Since oil was discovered in the Arabian Peninsula, there needs to be diplomacy when we talk about people's beliefs and traditions, when you have interests involved there. So Orientalists have definitely become, that's a cynical way of looking at it. I think maybe there's been some growth as well within the academic community. And certainly the impetus for attacking Islam prior to that, often based on an almost evangelical type of Christianity that existed, particularly within the Protestants in England, the Anglican Church and others, who really felt it their duty to Christianize the world. There was a very strong ideal that we should civilize the world, and certainly the Arabs need it just like anybody else. And then you have in the Western tradition of just a type of antagonism between the Islamic forces, because they were world power for centuries, and the Christian forces in Europe. I mean, that tension really, they were coexisting with a lot of tension, with few exceptions in different places, like periods of time in Sicily, for instance, during the time of King Roger of Sicily, where there was a lot of interpenetration going on between the Arabs and the Christians. So, in the 40th year, anyway, these Orientalists basically would traditionally say things almost like that he had epileptic fits, this type of thing. The more recent Orientalists, and not just Orientalists, but even theologians like Hans Kuhn wrote an interesting book called Christianity and the World Religions. One of the things he says in there is that we have to stop speaking derogatorily about the Prophet Muhammad, because whatever was taking place there, it was certainly, by all accounts that we have, a sincere phenomenon. In other words, he's not willing to accept, and that's his prerogative, that this was a revelation, but he is willing to accept that the person was sincerely deluded, which is a big difference from simply saying that he was insane or that he was had malintention, right? The experience was basically this. It's come down in the tradition that at the age of 40, he was in the cave and a being came to him. It was in the form of a man. And he said, Iqra. This was the first word. Iqra. Now, Iqra can be interpreted two ways. It can be interpreted recite or read. Now, the Prophet Muhammad was neither a reciter of poetry, nor could he read. And he said at that point, مَا أَنَا بِقَارِئ. I don't know how to recite, or I don't know how to read. It could be interpreted both ways. Generally, it's interpreted that he did not know how to read. Iqra a second time, Iqra a third time, and then in the tradition it says that he was actually squeezed until he thought that his sides would burst. And then he said, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. And this is the beginning of this phenomenon that will take place for the next 23 years of his life before he dies. The revelation said, read in the name of your Lord, who created the human being from a clinging tissue. Read in the name of your Lord, the most generous, who taught the human being with the pen and taught the human being that which he did not know. That's not a very eloquent translation, but I'm just doing that directly from the Arabic, and I'm sure the text will have a better interpretation there. At this point, the Prophet was concerned. He did not know what was happening to him. He went down to his wife and explained to her what happened. His wife comforted him, Khadija al-Kubra. She said to him, she was an older woman, and her uncle had been an Arab who converted to Christianity. She was familiar with Revelation. She said, you are a good person. You take care of the orphan. You take care of the widows. You take care of the needy. And I don't think something bad would happen to you like this. Because he thought that this might be like some kind of evil spirit or something. I mean, he did feel that. They go, she takes him to her uncle Waraqa bin Nawfal, who had some knowledge of previous books. And he says a very interesting thing. He said, this is the namus. Now, for people that know Greek, namus comes from nomos. Right? And nomos means the law. So in other words, he was saying, this is namus that came to Musa. In other words, you are being given a revelation. That's what this is. And he told him, your people, when they find this out, will become your enemies and drive you from this city. And he said, would they do that? Because he had never done anything wrong to them before that. And he said, they will do that, and I wish that I was a young man, that I might be by your side doing this. Now, during the next period of time, he begins to get these revelations. The next one, Ya ayyuhal muzammiru. Oh, you wrapped, because he used to wrap himself when he would meditate, wrapped in a cloak. And these revelations begin to come with a regularity. Now, the Prophet Muhammad, in a description, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that sometime the revelation came like a bell, like the ringing of a bell, as a vibration, and then it would move into to letters, and then into the actual words. And it's interesting because when you hear, for instance, there's a group of letters that many of the chapters of the Quran begin with. 19 chapters in the Quran begin with these letters. They're called muqatta'at. And if you hear them recited, they أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألف لام ميم. Now you can hear the vibratory force there. And this is how some of these revelations were beginning, literally like a vibration, moving into the material world from another realm, according to the Muslim tradition. During this time, he began to tell close people. And Khadija is the first person who believes him, his wife, which is interesting. She didn't, abandon him. She was right there and she said, I believe this. His nephew, who was his cousin, who was living in his house, son of his uncle, he was taking care of him, Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was a young boy at that time, but he also says that he believes, tells him that he believes in the people from very close people that knew him. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was a very close person. But at a certain point, he's commanded to warn his family. So he gathers them all together. And he says to them, what would you say if I told you on the other side of the mountains of Mecca, waiting to attack you? And they said, we would believe you, because you're al-Amin, you're the trustworthy one. And he said, what would you say if I was messenger of God? And I was sent to you. And they said, we don't believe you. And they rejected that. And then as more people begin to come into Islam,